Thank you very much, Ethan. I'm going to get a picture of the crowd here. So, yeah. Now, time goes by pretty quick, and I forget who I spoke to and when, so I always like to do that. Yeah, I will. Let me put my phone on mute there and set it down. Yeah, thank y'all very much. I brought my high-tech pointing device, and we'll go through this. It's going to be a little short on landmarks because I could have give you 3 hours here easy, so I'm mostly going to concentrate on early roads. I've intended to put a program together for years on the original roads, trails, things that were here before College Station. And so I'm concentrating mostly on College Station, but I'm going to start with the county-wide. So, yeah, College Station is part of the first Anglo colony, the Austin's colony, 1821, 1823. They got it established, and it went from the Gulf Coast to the old San Antonio Road, covered all of from east of the Brazos River to west of the Colorado River. And Stephen Austin was the first impresario that got to bring in Anglo immigrants. And so the area known as Brazos County is on the north edge of his colony. It was really not populated early. Everyone was coming up from the coast. Travel was mostly by boat, and so they'd come up the rivers from the coast, and they never really got up to this part of the county until the late 1820s. And our north boundary of Brazos County is the old San Antonio Road, so we're on the edge of that. So 200 years ago, there were only 2 roads in what's now Brazos County. The old San Antonio Road, there'd been written documentation in the 1600s of Spanish missionaries on that road, so it's hundreds of years old, and I'm sure they were following a Native American trail, but it mostly went from Mexico, Laredo area to San Antonio, over to Natchitoches, Louisiana. And so this is actually, Stephen Austin came through Brazos County in 1821. He wrote in his diary, first time he came to Texas, and when he crossed the Navasota River, July 30th, 1821, he mentions, the type of terrain, the prairies, the way the river was when he crossed. And then they spent 2 days before they crossed the Brazos River, and he said he explored to the south of the road and describes prairies. So I don't know if he got down to College Station, but at least he probably got to Bryan area and just exploring. And the next year, he actually created this map of Texas. Pretty crude map, but it had the creeks and trails, the rivers and trails. And that's really all there was out here. Was, the topography. There wasn't any real mountains or anything to describe, but he dashed on where the rivers branched, connected, and where the old San Antonio Road was up here, and the Opelousas Road and the La Bahia Road. So the next slide I'll show you. I just sort of showed you where the Navasota River took off a confluence with the Brazos. So Brazos County is below the old San Antonio Road between the Navasota and the Brazos. So it's on his map. Brazos County is unique. Of all the 254 counties, I don't think there's another one that has natural boundaries. We only have one part of our county boundary that's a straight line defined by surveyors. Everything else is natural. Our county is described as the center line of the Brazos River, and the center line of the Navasota River, and the center line of the old San Antonio Road, until you get to the town of Benchley, which is Highway 6, where it crosses there at the old San Antonio Road on Highway 6. Then it goes a straight line to the Brazos River, just straight across, diagonally across people's property. And that's the only straight section in there. And that's the part that nobody can really figure out exactly where it is, because it's described from a point below the late Leander Harrell's home, and this was in 1841 when they described it. So Leander Harrell had already died and his home was abandoned. So you have to know where that was, and then go down to the middle of the road below that and go to a point in the middle of the Brazos River below Fort Tenochtitlan, which they still haven't found exactly where it was. So this is the oldest map of College Station. I know it's really faint and it's really bright yellow, but I just discovered this a few years ago by chance reading on the Texas General Land Office website what's available for Brazos County. I was always looking just to see if anything new was in Brazos County, and I found this map called Surveys in Austin's Colony along the Saline Creek. And so I highlighted on the map the property boundaries. These were the land grant boundaries, the leagues. Here's Richard Carter's land grant. They're each 4,428 acres. They're 1 league or 5,000 varas square, about 2.3 miles square. And they surveyed all these out in 1830s, real early 1830s. And being Brazos County was not real early in the colonization of Austin's colony, they had time to send surveyors before the settlers came in. And so they pre-surveyed all these square leagues in Brazos County. And that's Bryan College Station's in now. But this map is, it's like a treasure map to me. It's got numbers on how they surveyed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8. Actually, 9 and 10 are Stephen F. Austin's 2 land grants that he owned when he passed away. And his nephew, the Bryan family, inherited them. But the creeks, and they actually highlighted them, but they put the edge of the woods, where you had the prairies, and then you had the wooded areas on the creeks. So all of this would be prairie, and then you get down into more toward the Brazos River. This is Saline Creek, which was renamed to Richard Carter, or to Carter Creek, and it's still today known as Carter Creek. And the town of Boonville, town of Bryan, and Texas A&M came in. This is sort of where they were fitted in. Richard Carter, Central College Station, 1830. And then 1841 map is the first map that actually shows roads on it. It's got the big land grants, has the names on them, R. Carter, Morgan Rector, Thomas Carruthers. But besides having all the creeks, and they actually had already renamed the creek Carter's Creek, the town of Boonville is the only town. Here's the Navasota River and the edge of the Brazos River. But you can see the creeks. That's what was important. There's no fences. There's no big mountains or any kind of landmarks. So the creeks are about all there was as far as if you're traveling that you can find something. So it was really important for people to know where they were and what creek they were on. But they drew roads in on this one. So 1841, Brazos County was created out of Washington County. It had been the north part of Washington County. And there was enough people on this side of the Brazos River, they needed a seat of government up here, so they created the town of Boonville in the middle of the county. And when they drew this map, they traced on several roads. They're just little dotted, they're 2 little parallel dotted lines all over that map. And so I've highlighted the creeks in blue, and you can see Carter's Creek. Richard Carter's land grant, his 4,428 acre land grant, town of Boonville. This is actually where Harvey Road is in College Station today. This is Texas Avenue. So we're right here at the corner of Harvey and Texas, and all of that was Richard Carter's all the way to Boonville, which is out by the north of, it's at the Toyota dealership basically in Bryan. So that was his land grant. And let's see what the next one. And so zooming in a little bit on Richard Carter's area, you can see these dashed lines coming, several of them come in and out of Boonville town site, which makes sense. But this was 1841, the town was founded 1841. So apparently, or obviously, there was roads that predated the town. When this map was created, the town was new. And so you can see over here a crossroads. So that one was going across high ground through the prairies, and they didn't know Boonville would end up being a little further to the east. So I decided, and here I took the map and I traced over all those dotted lines in pink just to highlight where they are all over the map. They're heading out to the ferries, there wasn't any bridges yet, but there was ferries, and on the Navasota River there was fords, hard bottom, shallow areas where they could cross without a ferry. The Brazos was too large to have the fords, so they would ferry on the Brazos. But the roads would lead that. Anything going really south was heading toward Washington Brazos. East was toward Fanthorpe's Inn over at Anderson. Here toward Madisonville, there was no Madisonville yet, but there was a community called Midway on the old San Antonio Road in East Texas. You went to Wheelock or over toward Benchley, and this was heading toward Caldwell. Caldwell and Boonville were founded almost at the same time. And so then I started putting it, the city of College Station current, the present day 2026 city limits of College Station to see where these roads are. And if you know the city limits, this is actually Highway 30. This is Veterans Park and on out, going out between Highway 60, University Drive, and Harvey Road. That's the little piece that runs out to Highway 30. You can see this road from Boonville going off toward Ferguson Crossing on the Navasota River, the hard bottom ford here. They drew it fairly straight, but today Highway 30 is out here on this red line and out here on the end of Fitch, and along this black line is Highway 30. So I'm sure the road really meandered, pretty much following what's Highway 30 today. It didn't go near as straight as they show it there. That was more, the way they mapped and surveyed these roads, when the surveyors were surveying the properties, they would keep track of how far they were going up one of the boundary lines, and they'd cross a creek, come in or out of the woods, and I guess they would make note if they crossed a known trail. And so then as they got that information back to San Felipe, where Stephen Austin's headquarters were, they would draw it on their maps and they would measure and make little marks. Okay, here's where we cross the creek. So only about and these are 2.3 mile squares, so in the middle, there was really no surveying happening, so that's why they sort of went straight, because they only knew at the boundaries. They would draw it wiggly, just sort of on the creeks, because they knew it didn't go straight, but I think the roads, they just pretty much drew them straight. And then here, I took the same map, I'll go back, and I took the 1841 map out from under it, and I put 2026 city streets. So here you have Rock Prairie Road going east of town. Scott and White is hospital right here. Texas Avenue is right under this black line. It was running right down the old land grant boundaries. Highway 30 out here, Veterans Park. So you can see how these roads sort of don't follow any of the current streets, but in some places they do. If you're familiar with out at River Run, out west of College Station, Hopes Creek Road is the old road along the high ridge of the Brazos River in Brazos County. And I think this road really is Hopes Creek Road. They just don't have it exactly on where it is, but it ends up at the same bridge at down at Milliken. And Highway 60, this is from Boonville, which was right up here. You had the Jones Ferry, and it became Jones Bridge Road. It runs right to where Highway 60 crosses, going towards Snook, and so they just drew it straight across. And then you had a road running up this is actually Rock Prairie Road or Peach Creek Road, actually. If you come down Highway 6 south of College Station down there at the intersection of FM 159 heading to Milliken, you can go up Peach Creek Road, and it connects to Rock Prairie Road and comes up by Lake Creek Park. Well, I think this pink line is actually probably supposed to be right there on top of Peach Creek Road. And you can see little pieces of roads that work their way up to what's now Highway 30 and Whidbey Fitch. So I was really surprised that none of the old maps showed Rock Prairie Road, because it's well known as Sulphur Springs Road and came all the way into Bryan from Sulphur Springs. But I believe that, these are 1841 roads, and this was more of 1860s road. And so here's another neat map that I've found in a booklet. In 1962, the city of Bryan was celebrating their 100th anniversary, and they, Ms. Nance, who was on the Brazos County Historic Commission, they created this little map to show where old towns and things were. The black dots were the old towns, and the circles are the current towns in 1962. But they were showing how the trails connected from Anderson at the Fanthorpe Inn, came across Ferguson Crossing on the Navasota into Boonville up to Benchley, and Wheelock was up here. Democrat Crossing. You notice on the Navasota they say crossing, crossing. That's because there was no ferry needed. They would ford the river. And then you had a ferry where Highway 6 crosses today into Navasota, into Brazos County. It was Arnold's Ferry. Had Robinson's Ferry at Washington Brazos, Milliken's Ferry to get to there. The old town of Milliken wasn't really a town, it was just where all the Millikens lived. There were several brothers and sons, and they all owned all these land grants. They were some of the old 300 original family, what they call the old 300 from 1824, and they had bought or gotten their land grants on the north side of the Brazos, near Washington Brazos. They were really the only settlers in the county early. The Jones Ferry, the Jones family, there's still Jones family that owns land on that land grant of the Jones family. That's Highway 60. So that's a pretty good historic map. I was glad that I have that because I know Dr. Nance and his wife, who was a descendant of the surveyor of Boonville. They had a lot of historical knowledge. I never did get to meet them. I know their son today, Jerry Nance, but this is a culmination or a compilation of a lot of their historic knowledge, and I was really glad that they put that into a book in the early 60s. And then this is another little map I found. I didn't plot the whole map, but it's stagecoach routes of Texas. And 1850s, the railroad hadn't come in, been built yet, and so stagecoaches were the way to travel if you were gonna, unless you were traveling in your own private horse or wagon, you were in a stagecoach. So they actually had stagecoach lines running between Anderson and Boonville and Franklin, Texas, and running on up to Midway. They didn't really, you notice there's not really any crossing the Brazos River. And apparently the stagecoaches didn't want to get on the ferry. It might have been, the ferries just wouldn't really handle the stagecoach, especially if it had people in it. So it might have been a lot of trouble. So they would cross the Navasota in and out to get to Boonville. And if you want to go from Washington Brazos in a stagecoach, you mostly went to Anderson and then to Boonville so they could cross at Ferguson Crossing. And if you were going to Washington Brazos toward Waco, you go down toward Branham and then run up to Caldwell and head on up north that way. So the Brazos River was a hard river to cross. It's one reason not hardly any railroads crossed it either later. But the 1850s, the stagecoach actually established the mail routes. So they would have at least weekly mail delivery, if not quicker than that. Most of the stages were private. I guess they all were. It wasn't a government thing, but they probably gave them some incentive to carry mail. So it was a venture that was beneficial to them if they would sign up and carry mail for the government. And this is a 1927 little article in January 27, the Eagle, Bryan Eagle, ran a little series of articles by Ms. Buchanan. And she interviewed a man named W.W. Griffin. And it's like a two-part story, but what really caught my eye and the way I found this was searching for the word wagon road or stagecoach. And he talks about the old houses in Bryan, how there was only like 6 houses in East Bryan. And he tells who they were, he tells where Harvey Mitchell lived, everything. And this is 1866 he's talking about. So the town of Bryan had just been created 1860 on the prairie, and they started moving during the Civil War, moving buildings there from Boonville and building new buildings and starting to build the railroad toward Bryan. But over here in this paragraph, he says, he talks about a guy living where the A&M College is built later. Before A&M College, Mr. Wooten lived in a house that's near where the textile building is on the college. Just across the road from the section house south of College. So he's talking in 1927, so he's given landmarks to tell things from the 1860s where they were located. So he says across from the section house, that's the railroad maintenance foreman's house, south of the college, was located a small store and stable where the stage drivers, heroes of early progress, changed their tired teams as they drove like mad over the rough, dangerous roads of the day. So there was a stagecoach station in College Station. And so I thought, man, I know exactly where that is. I've never heard that there is one. I highlighted the same little article I read. And this is actually the section house. This is probably 1930s, 40s. B.B. Holland, that a lot of us knew, the local teacher and grew up here. He gave us this for the 75th anniversary of College Station. It was one of the items he pulled from his family archives. And his grandparents, his grandfather was the section foreman for the Southern Pacific for this area. It's a 25-mile piece of the railroad. His grandfather was in charge, lived just there south of George Bush Drive, south of Jersey Street on the railroad. You can actually see the railroad rails right here in the photo. They're looking north toward what's Olson Field up here, if you can see it, it was there. And he had a little house where a little rail car would come out he'd push out one of the little cars for going up and down the tracks. So it had its own little rail tracks going into the garage. Then there was some maintenance sheds. But Mr. Holland said, yeah, his grandmother would cook for the guys that worked for the railroad there on the section, and she was real proud of the house and made sure it was very beautiful, and they won awards from the railroad for having like the most beautiful section house. But we know exactly where that was, and then this article says just across the road from where the section house is was the little store where the stagecoach stopped. And here's an article in 1967 in the Galveston News advertising the railroad, and it says how passenger trains leave Houston daily, Sundays accepted, at 2:15 p.m. They arrive in Milliken at 6:30 p.m. So it's a 4-hour, 15-minute trip from Houston to Milliken, and they connect with the Sawyer's line of stages for Boonville, Wheelock, Marlin. So when you got to Boonville, there were stagecoaches that would make your connection, get off the train, get on the stagecoach, and head from Milliken to Boonville and on up to Wheelock. 1 month later, the first train actually pulled into Bryan. So this, I didn't research, but probably find where this got revised within a few months. And instead of the stages connecting at Boonville, they were probably connecting in the city of Bryan, the new city of Bryan, and then they could take you north. And that was right at the end of the Civil War. So a lot of people never did get on the stage. Bryan got a real high number of relocated people from the southeast that had lost everything in the Civil War, and they ended up in Bryan because that was the end of the train line in 1867. And then here's sort of showing where the section house. This is a 1942 U.S. Army map of Texas A&M and its surroundings. It was a topographic map because the Corps of Cadets, the ROTC program, and they had the Army barns and things over here near where Kyle Field is. And I just wrote on here sort of, that's the fence going out toward the airport, George Bush Drive, then Luther Street West. Here's the railroad, and then the INGN Railroad ran down what's now Marion Pugh Drive. But there's the section house and the little garage and the maintenance sheds. And it's about where Fidelity Street, across from where Fidelity Street is. This house was there, I remember it clearly. It might have made it to 1980. I know it was there in the mid to late 70s still. And then Hardlicka had Uncle Ed's little beer joint in place down here that became Fugate's and the picnic pantry, and it's still a little store over there right across, or Luther extended across now, but that was Hardlicka's. And then this is Holloman Drive, which was called County Road or the Bohemian Hall Road because the Bohemian Hall was right up that road. So we know that the stagecoach had the little stop there somewhere in that area. I need to look up some deed records. I know the family owner, it was north of where Hardlicka's owned. It was called the Cana property, K-A-N-A. They owned a section up there. And I want to look into that and see if there's any reference to the stage store or stop. Now this is just sort of jumping as far as transportation history. 1914, the first paved road in Brazos County was Main Street in Bryan. They used a sort of an asphalt pavement on it. 1915, the first test pavement in Texas was a 1/4 mile. It was Military Walk on the A&M campus. They actually did it as an experimental pavement. They had started the A&M engineering experiment station. And so TxDOT wasn't even created yet. And they did a test pavement of Military Walk because so many thousand people walked on it so many times each day going to the Sabisa and back. And they actually, I found an article where it was the first test pavement. It wasn't the first pavement, but it was the first one that they were actually experimenting and monitoring its progress of how the pavement would work under foot traffic. In 1917, the Highway Department was created, and they quickly planned, to improve existing roads. They weren't just out trying to build brand new and buy right-of-ways. They were just in the process of trying to connect roads. And in Brazos County, the connection was really important because you have the two rivers. So if you're going to connect to the next county, you had to get a bridge in. You couldn't have everybody ferry on a highway. And up until the TxDOT was created, each county and each county judge and county commissioners, they didn't worry about trying to share and deal with the next county. They dealt with their county, with roads in their county. And so even if they didn't have a river, there was really no connection across the county boundaries. It was just sort of by chance and need if there was connection. There was no planned connection because it cost money to build roads into other counties. They didn't connect. And this is a 1919 map showing TxDOT's plans for improvements through Brazos County, and they were showing proposed highway routes, existing roads. They show like the creeks, Carter's Creek, Lick Creek, the town of Welborn. And I've highlighted a few things. They purposely put all the churches on the map. They didn't put all the existing roads out in the county, but they did locate because people knew where churches were. And that was a landmark. If you wanted to build a road, they were showing they were going to connect Rock Prairie Baptist Church and School to the Washington Church is up here at Highway 30, where Washington Chapel Church is. A&M was over here. This is actually Texas Avenue and University Drive. They were planning to make a highway out of that. And you see Sulphur Springs Road is starting at Rock Prairie Baptist Church and going to the Navasota River. And that's mostly Rock Prairie Road today, and then it changes to Sulphur Springs at the end down there in the Navasota River. This is Highway 30, Harvey Road heading on out through Harvey and then on out and crosses at Ferguson Crossing. And there was a church, Bright Light Church is still there on Highway 30. Bethel Academy, that's at the corner of Harvey. Actually, that's the old location. Today, Bethel Lutheran Church, or Bethel Baptist, I'm sorry, is at the town of Harvey next to C&J's, and it's one of the oldest churches. There's a Bethel church in there, Old Bethel Cemetery. So they put the churches on it and as landmarks. So I've highlighted it up to show that this is actually Rock Prairie Road today. Rock Prairie Baptist Church was, a lot of you remember, it was just 15 years ago or so that the Scott and White came in and redeveloped that whole area as their hospital, and Rock Prairie moved down on Mr. Ritchie's property to the east and has a nice church there today. And the historic marker is still at the old location. If you go to the traffic circle in front of Scott and White Hospital, a really large grass traffic circle, that's the location where the church was. Wasn't right in the center of the traffic circle, but it was within the traffic circle. And so that's this intersection here. And so this is mostly Rock Prairie Road. You can see Lick Creek, so Pebble Creek and all of this down here. Barron Road went from Rock Prairie to Welborn. The two railroads are in, and this was Highway 6. It was originally called Highway 2 on the first map, and then they realigned where they connect and leave Waco, and they realized Highway 2 would be going a different route, not coming south toward Galveston. They would have this as Highway 6. F&B Road and Old College. You notice if you come up what's now Welborn Road past the university, how it's distinctive how Old College has that big curve where the chicken oil, and you see that on here. So that was Highway 6, and it ran on into Bryan. And then F&B crossed the railroad at the same location and went out. This is sort of Turkey Creek Road that went on up out of Bryan and intersected F&B. And then it came out and went to the Jones Bridge, or what they call Jones Bridge Road, which is Highway 60 today. But it's really neat. Sulphur Springs Road today, there is 2 Sulphur Springs Road in Brazos County, and they're still part of this original Sulphur Springs Road. There's a spring actually on the Navasota River, and you can go down there and see it if the water's low. It's in a sandbar in the middle of the river at the end of Sulphur Springs Road. If you drive Rock Prairie out past Lick Creek Park, keep going, you'll get to a 3-way intersection where you've got Peach Creek Road, Rock Prairie, and Sulphur Springs. And you follow Sulphur Springs to the end, you're at the Navasota River, and there's like a sandbar, and it's real black on top of the white sand. So it's from the sulfur, a reaction of the sulfur with the waters and the sand that makes it black in there. But that's the spring, and it was actually a low place where they could cross from Anderson also at Sulphur Springs. But the road was named Sulphur Springs, and it went all the way into Bryan, and it was called Sulphur Springs. This is Texas Avenue. It was originally called Sulphur Springs before 1931 when TxDOT created Texas Avenue, Highway 6 on top of the old road. And it turned, and so Sulphur Springs Road is actually written on the map through the 1960s for University Drive at Northgate. All the maps say Sulphur Springs Road. And it was heading to connect to the highway from Sulphur Springs. So if you was trying to get to Highway 6, you would get here. Today, there's Martin's Barbecue. Martin's Place in Bryan is on Sulphur Springs Road. And that's actually another extension. It ran up and turned and connected with Highway 6 here. So you've still got a piece today called Sulphur Springs at Martin's Place, and you've still got the tail end of Sulphur Springs Road out there on the east end. All the rest of it has been renamed, but it is one of the old roads from the 1800s. And it doesn't follow any property lines. That's one clue that you, on an old road, when you look at the maps, those old land grant boundaries, nice and square, but the old roads, they were just trying to get from here to there in practical terms, and not just shortest distance, but high ground, not through the woods. And so that the roads were just conveniently placed. Landowners at the time were using them. They didn't want to have to go down, turn 90-degree corners to, every 2.5 miles and zigzag their way to somewhere. So it was just fine with everyone. And so the routes on the oldest roads didn't get squared off. When TxDOT got involved, they started squaring them off and running them down the property lines. And here's something I know. This is right near Ann Hayes' house. And it's my last slide. But this is HEB at Jones Crossing. I'm looking north, if you used to cross at Kane Road. But this is old Highway 6. And this bridge is actually over 100 years old, this concrete culvert. There's several of them going down all the way to Welborn, a lot of them in private pastures. This one still has pavement up to a dead end, and Ann's house is right here. But this was originally, in the 1860s, just a gravel road. When they built the railroad, all the way from Houston, there was a gravel road that it would sometimes switch sides, but it was what they used to build the railroad. And so it became a county road in a prescriptive right-of-way. It was never given or surveyed out. And then in the early 1910s, when cars started becoming really easy to come by after World War I, and around World War I, when cars were really getting to be where you could buy them, had dealerships, they were planning tourist routes across the U.S., national tourist routes. They had named them, the Bankhead Highway, the Meridian Highway, the Lincoln Highway. And so you had two that were sort of on top of each other in Texas, the King of Trails and the Meridian. TxDOT hadn't started yet, so they didn't have numbered highways. And this is the King of Trails and also the Meridian Highway right there. And it's still there today. The bridge is there. If you went from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, to Galveston on the King of Trails, you came right through that culvert right there in College Station and went on down to Welborn across a lot of other ones. And like I said, it was Highway 2 and then became Highway 6. And in 1931, they moved Highway 6 over to where Texas Avenue is today. And this became Old Welborn Road, and that's what they call the pieces that remain of Old Welborn Road. South of Navasota, it's still called Old Highway 6. I mean, south of Milliken, you get on it, and the signs say Old Highway 6. I always wanted, the King of Trails, they had signs. These companies like AAA and the ones that created the travel maps, they were making money by selling you maps on how to do tourist travel, how to get across the U.S. and connect. They planned out the connectivity of the roads before TxDOT. And they would put signs to make sure you didn't miss a turn. So wherever it said to turn, like and cross the railroad, if you were on the King of Trails, you'd look for an enamel sign nailed to a tree that had a big KT. I've seen photos of them. And so apparently they were on this road in Brazos County, and I've always wished I could run across an old tree with an old enamel sign still nailed on it that says KT. I've never seen one in person, but I always thought that would be, they were out there, and I don't know how many were saved or still out there nailed to a tree or laid on the ground on a rotted tree. But that's really the end, and I'll go, I got a few more minutes. I'm gonna actually run to a couple more slides here. The railroad, I didn't even really start into the railroad, but you know, it's a trail. It's still the original exact same place it always was since it was built. And so that all started in the 1850s, got to Milliken. During the Civil War, it stopped at Milliken. They were building this part of it, but to Bryan, by the end of the Civil War, they started laying the rails, and the train came into Bryan in 1867. And they created their own towns. Milliken was actually 3 miles down here, and so the railroad moved it up here, or created their own town, called it Milliken. They created Welborn, they created Bryan, and all the way up like Hearn. Those are all created by the railroad. They purposely were not going through any existing villages because they wanted to sell you new property in a new town. And this is one other little thing that's sort of a lasting thing. This is a railroad map. I've turned it to match the aerial photograph. But it's showing a pond and a Y. This is in the right-of-way where they would turn the steam trains around south of A&M. If you came to A&M and they needed to turn the train around, they didn't have a turntable. They had those in some cities like Hearn. So the steam train, it couldn't really run backwards at full speed back to Houston to bring like people to Aggie football games. So they would disconnect the locomotive and tender, and they'd run it down and turn it around on the Y and back it up into the train while the football game was going on. And so they also had a pond for emergency water if they needed for their steam. Later, the steam got really sophisticated where they had to filter and sterilize or use evaporated distilled type waters to make their locomotives last. But in the early 1800s, when they were cutting firewood and burning it in a locomotive, they could pull water out of a pond. So the railroad always had ponds that they owned along the route they had created for water for trains. But this is showing, and they sold off this piece with a pond on it in the 1950s, 60s. But they still today own the right-of-way where the Y is. They still paying taxes on it. And this is showing sort of where it is. At this Southwest Parkway, 2018, heading up toward A&M. Kyle Field is not far up here. And you can sort of see where if you look at Southwest Parkway, C&J Barbecue, gas station. See that trees? The railroad owns that still to this day. They've owned it since 1860. And it's where they used to have track running in here to turn the steam train around. I don't know why they haven't sold it. They sold the whole piece of land to the apartments that had the pond on it. So in between these apartments across from Southwest Parkway is a piece of old 1860s rail line. It's sort of neat. And then Bohemian Hall, I mentioned that earlier. I've been doing some research on it because there's also a Shiloh Hall in the College Station Cemetery. It was Fort Shiloh Restaurant. And that was also a community organization for the farmers of the area to share entertainment, but also to share agricultural equipment and things. And Bohemian Hall predated that. Shiloh Hall, or I don't know if it was a competitor or what, but it was on the Hollocks property. And it was, I found out right where it is. And I found a map. They actually have it wrong on a map. This is what now is Holloman Drive, Luther Street, Welsh comes through. And so they show Bohemian Hall here, but it's actually up here on what's now Holloman, has the little bend where it turns. You can go down Winding Road, Caudale Street right here. And there's two houses right there on the corner. There's now a street called Taurus Street. Came into the Hollocks property. Mr. Fitch put it in. And there's two houses on that corner. And when I was growing up, Reverend Malcolm Bain, First Baptist Church pastor, I think he lived in this house that is built where the Bohemian Hall had been. I'm going to check with that. We're working with First Baptist to get a historical marker for them, and I'm going to ask them to confirm that that was Bain's. Maybe the church owned that property, but when Mr. Clark in the 30s or late 30s, early 40s, purchased all this property, he was working his way south from A&M buying property and developing it into neighborhoods, and he put in the knoll in here. The building was already torn down. It mentions going around the boundary of the old Bohemian Hall, but that's sort of a neat piece of College Station history right in the middle of town. That it was just an old, like, dance hall you find out in the old rural towns. And so that's the end. So, questions?